The Lion of Judah, worshipped by millions as a living god, died alone in a palace basement, suffocated with a pillow by the very soldiers who once knelt before him. This is the dark truth about how Ethiopia's last emperor was brutally murdered, and why the world stayed silent about one of history's most shocking assassinations. In 1974, Haile Selassie stood as one of the world's most revered leaders. Rastafarians believed he was the Messiah. World leaders sought his counsel. He had survived Italian invasion, modernized Ethiopia, and ruled for over 4 decades. But behind the palace walls, a revolution was brewing that would strip away everything: his throne, his dignity, and ultimately his life. What followed was a systematic destruction of a man who had been treated like a god, ending in a murder so brutal that the perpetrators hid the truth for decades. The signs of danger had been building for months, but Selassie seemed blind to them. Throughout 1973, Ethiopia was ravaged by a famine that killed over 200,000 people, while the emperor continued to live in opulent luxury. Television footage showed starving children in the countryside, while state media aired banquets at the palace. The contrast was devastating, and it sparked outrage that would soon boil over. Young military officers, educated and frustrated, began meeting in secret. The revolution began not with violence, but with humiliation. In February 1974, the Derg started arresting high-ranking officials, but they left Selassie untouched for now. Instead, they subjected him to a campaign of psychological torture that was almost medieval in its cruelty. They forced the 82-year-old emperor to watch as they publicly tried and executed his closest advisors. They made him dismiss his government, piece by piece, until he was completely isolated. Most shocking of all, they showed him the BBC documentary, The Unknown Famine, which exposed the starvation his government had hidden. The man who had been revered as infallible was forced to watch his own failures broadcast to the world. But this was just the beginning of his ordeal. On September 12, 1974, the final act began. The Derg arrived at the palace with a simple declaration. Haile Selassie was no longer emperor. They read him a manifesto, accusing him of economic mismanagement and neglect of his people. The man who had once addressed the League of Nations, who had dined with world leaders, who had been featured on the cover of Time magazine, was now a prisoner in his own palace. They loaded him into a Volkswagen Beetle, a deliberate insult, as he had always traveled in grand processions, and drove him to the Meadowwood Palace. There, they confined him to a small room in the basement, the same basement where he had once kept his pet lions. The symbolism was intentional. The Lion of Judah was now in a cage of his own making, but the Derg's cruelty was just beginning. For months, Selassie lived in captivity, and the conditions were deliberately degrading. The man who had once worn robes of silk and gold was given prison clothes. His meals, once served on silver platters, arrived on tin plates. He was allowed no visitors, no newspapers, no contact with the outside world. The Derg wanted to break him completely before they killed him. They succeeded in ways that were heartbreaking to witness. Palace servants later testified that they could hear him singing hymns to himself in the dark, trying to maintain his sanity. Sometimes he would call out for his wife, who had died years earlier, seemingly forgetting where he was. The psychological torture was so complete that by the time they decided to murder him, he was already a broken man. But even this wasn't enough for his captors. Subscribe now to uncover more dark truths about history's most shocking assassinations that the world tried to forget. The decision to kill Selassie was made in secret by the Derg's inner circle, but the method they chose revealed their true nature. They couldn't simply execute him. That would make him a martyr. Instead, they planned something far more sinister. They would make it look like natural causes. On August 27, 1975, nearly a year after his overthrow, they put their plan into action. The official story was that the 83-year-old emperor had died of respiratory failure, during a routine medical procedure. But the truth, revealed decades later through testimonies and investigations, was far more horrifying. 3 soldiers entered his basement room in the early morning hours. They found him weakened by months of poor treatment, barely able to stand. What happened next was so brutal that even the perpetrators struggled to describe it years later. The murder itself was carried out with shocking cruelty. According to witness testimonies that emerged years later, the soldiers didn't use weapons or poison. They used their bare hands. They held him down and suffocated him with a pillow, pressing it over his face until he stopped breathing. The irony was devastating. The man who had been called the conquering Lion of Judah was killed like a helpless animal. But the horror didn't end there. The Derg buried his body in a shallow grave beneath a concrete slab in the palace grounds, without ceremony, without prayer, without even a marked grave. For a man who had been worshipped as divine, this was the ultimate desecration. They then announced his death as if it were natural, and the world largely accepted the lie. The cover-up had begun, and it would last for decades. Here's where the story becomes even darker. The world knew something was wrong, but chose to look the other way. Intelligence agencies had reports about Selassie's harsh treatment and suspicious death. But Cold War politics made Ethiopia's new military government useful to both superpowers. The Rastafarian community, who had worshipped Selassie as Jah incarnate, refused to believe he was dead at all, claiming he had ascended to heaven. Meanwhile, the Ethiopian people, exhausted by famine and war, were too focused on survival to demand justice for their former emperor. The perfect crime had been committed, a murder witnessed by the world, but acknowledged by no one. The Derg had not only killed Selassie, they had erased him from history itself. The truth about Selassie's murder remained buried for over 2 decades. The forensic evidence confirmed what witnesses had testified. This was not a natural death. The man who had once been seen as immortal by millions had been murdered in the most mortal way possible. The revelation sent shockwaves through the Rastafarian community and forced historians to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the world as silence is complicity in murder. The investigation also revealed that at least 60 other high-ranking officials had been killed in similar fashion, their bodies buried in mass graves around the palace. Selassie's murder was an isolated act of violence. It was part of a systematic campaign of terror that claimed thousands of lives. Haile Selassie's brutal murder represents one of history's most shocking falls from grace. A man who had been revered as a living god, who had modernized a nation and inspired a religious movement, was reduced to a victim of petty political revenge. His death revealed the dark truth about power, that reverence can turn to hatred overnight, and that those who lift you up can just as easily tear you down. The Derg's cruelty didn't just kill an emperor. It destroyed the very idea of Ethiopian monarchy that had lasted for millennia. Today, Selassie is remembered not as the flawed leader who ignored famine, but as a martyr whose brutal end reminds us that even gods can bleed. His murder remains a warning about what happens when revolution turns to revenge, and when the world chooses politics over justice. The brutal murder of Haile Selassie shows how quickly power can become powerlessness, and how history's darkest truths often remain buried for decades. If you want to explore more shocking assassinations that changed the world, subscribe and hit that notification bell. What do you think was Selassie's murder? Justified revenge for his failures? Or was it simply cold-blooded murder? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next video where we uncover more dark truths history tried to hide.